A doll designed to be both your child's friend and guardian goes rogue in the new horror film, M3GAN. Christian Bale enlists Edgar Allan Poe's help to solve a murder mystery in The Pale Blue Eye. And Tom Hanks is a curmudgeon old man who strikes an unexpected friendship with his pregnant neighbor in A Man Called Otto. All this and more is being released this weekend. Hello guys, I am the Hick Critic here bringing you my opinions of the films that were just released. Before we get started with the reviews, I want to quickly explain the new rating system that I'll be using for these videos. There will be 4 different ratings. The first is a full shot of whiskey, which is a film that I would either highly or pretty highly recommend. The second is a half full shot of whiskey, and that's a film that I did like and I did enjoy, but it's not a film that you need to rush out to go see. The third is a half empty shot of whiskey. These are the films that, yeah, they're not good, but they don't mess up badly enough that I hated the experience. They're just kind of mediocre. And finally, the fourth is an empty shot. These are the films that are legit bad. Films that I would avoid if at all possible. Shout out goes to my sister for these shot glass photos. These turned out amazing. Alright guys, let's get into the reviews. Our first film up tonight is the new horror film, M3GAN. Now, January tends to have a reputation, not unwarranted, for just dumping terrible films, usually horror films, that the studio has no faith in a desperate attempt to try to make some of their money back. That's why when I saw the date that this film was coming out, I was highly skeptical to say the very least. But if any of you are harboring that same skepticism I was, let me disabuse you of it right now because this film is a blast. The film stars a robotics engineer, played by Allison Williams, who is currently working at a toy company to try to create a lifelike robotic doll with artificial intelligence that can act as both a child's friend and guardian figure. And at the same time, her sister and brother-in-law are both killed in a terrible accident, leaving their young daughter, played by Violet McGraw, orphaned. So she takes her niece in and decides, as a test run, to have the prototype robot, named M3GAN, played by Amy Donald and voiced by Jenna Davis, to act as a confidant to her grieving niece, but as the artificial intelligence of the robot grows, so does the body count. This film lets you know right from the beginning what you're getting into, with a hilarious opening scene that lets you know that, well, yes, this is a horror film. It's also not going to take itself too seriously. Probably the thing that surprised me the most about this film was just how funny it was. And I don't mean funny like, oh, look at how bad that decision was, or anything like that. I mean legit moments where they're actually trying to make the audience laugh, and they succeed. I'm serious, this film is incredible at balancing the shifts in the tone, being able to go back and forth from being funny to threatening in a heartbeat, without it feeling jarring. That may be because the film leans a little bit into its inherent silliness, but without ever going into full-blown camp. And even as a horror film, this is still well constructed. The build-up is done well, the kills are well spaced out and creative, even pushing the boundaries of a PG-13 at times. And it even has a few legitimately good jump scares. Do you know how hard it is to pull off an effective jump scare? That is darn impressive. Now, I wouldn't call this film scary, but it does offer up some chilling moments, and a lot of the scarier elements are the subtler moments rather than the kills, like M3GAN's ability to perfectly imitate someone's voice in order to try to lure you into a secluded place. The special effects are also phenomenal. In order to make M3GAN come alive, they had a 12-year-old Amy Donald do the physical performance, with her face being digitally altered to give her an uncanny doll-like appearance, with Jenna Davis doing a childlike and yet creepy voice. All of these elements combine together to make the M3GAN character come alive, and I never doubted it for a second, making for one truly fantastic horror villain. And the slow buildup of her from actually working as intended to turning into a homicidal maniac is done slowly and organically. Honestly, the film's pacing in general is fantastic. Everything feels like it's revealed to us when it should be, and scenes last just as long as they need to. It would be fair to say, however, that M3GAN is not quite perfect. One instance of stock audio was played that really took me out of the moment. As the film approaches the climax, some of the characters that are supposed to be engineering geniuses, by the way, make some really dumb and genre-blind mistakes. And while Violet McGraw can actually handle a lot of her scenes where her character is supposed to be freaking out, I don't think she's that effective at selling the more emotional moments. While I wouldn't say that these are nitpicks, they don't seriously dampen the film. This is a really good film to start out the year. I had a ton of fun watching this, and this has the potential to be the child's play of a next generation. Assuming Blumhouse doesn't screw it up. But even if this winds up as a standalone film, I could see this becoming a horror cult classic that gets revisited and revisited as the years go on. M3GAN gets a full shot. Next up is the American remake of the 2015 Swedish dark comedy, A Man Called Otto, called A Man Called Otto. The original film was already a really accessible foreign language film for American audiences, which begs the question of why this remake needed to be made at all. The film stars Tom Hanks as a persistently rude old man who has recently lost his wife to cancer and has decided to take his own life in order to finally reunite with her. However, each attempt he makes just keeps failing and failing, whether it's because he's distracted by one of his neighbors violating one of the rules, or even just plain old happenstance. And as the film progresses, he begins to form a close relationship with his new neighbor, played by Mariana Trevino, a heavily pregnant Latina woman who maybe, just maybe, might be able to get him to appreciate the joys of life once again. One of the things that I like about this film, and indeed what I liked about the original, was that the film has a cynical tone and dark sense of humor. And that does help it stand out amongst the sea of other films of this type. You know, the mourning widow/widower drama, wherein they learn to appreciate life again. You know, those kind of films. And the film does manage to keep up that tone for about the first hour or so, before it does wind up succumbing to being a more feel-good, dare I say, Americanized version. But yeah, since he's the main character, let's talk about Otto for a second. Tom Hanks is kind of a mixed bag here. When he has to be excessively rude and grumpy, sometimes he hits the nail on the head, but other times it feels like he's trying too hard. Like, this is not his default persona, and so he has to put in extra effort to be a grump. And yeah, it often comes across like a performance. Not helping matters is the inconsistencies that are found in the character. Like, at one point, he seems fully accepting of a trans teenager and their identity, and yet later he gives kind of a grimace when he hears that another male character likes the color pink. This is kind of creating a conflicting image of the character, so it's difficult to get a handle on him. But even still, Hanks does manage to elicit some cruel laughs. There's a wonderful moment where he has a spar with a hospital clown, and another where he hassles some workers over the price of the rope that he's going to hang himself with. Both of these are great scenes. But really, what ends up making this film work as well as it does is the relationship that forms between Otto and his neighbor. The film does actually do a good job of illustrating just how such an unlikely bond might form, and they bounce off of each other pretty decently. But even still, the film can't shake off its missteps. The inconsistencies, some scenes feeling like they go on too long, and of course, the tonal issues. And speaking of which, the ending does get a bit too corny. Like, the film had a good feel to it at first, with the dark humor and Otto trying to commit suicide but failing miserably. And even some of the early heartwarming moments are hidden under a layer of cynicism, which did give the film an identity, but by the climax, the cynicism largely vanishes in favor of a feel-good and cliched climax. Unfortunately, the feeling that the original didn't need to be remade never really truly goes away, especially with how close it sticks to the source in terms of plot. Me personally, I would just say stick with the original. It feels more consistent and it doesn't feel as corny. Actually, sticking a lot closer to the mean spirit it originally started with, even as it gets more heartwarming. However, the strength of the original work, the strength from the chemistry between Tom Hanks and Marissa Tovino, and some genuinely funny moments does manage to push it into recommendation territory, but just barely. A Man Called Otto gets a half-full shot. Next up is the new Netflix film, The Pale Blue Eye, which was released in limited theaters for an Oscar-qualifying run 2 weeks ago. Although I'm not sure why, when, while the film certainly isn't bad, I wouldn't call it award-worthy by any stretch. The film stars Christian Bale as Augustus Lander, a 19th century detective who is tasked with tracking down the murderer of a gruesome slaying of a cadet at the United States Military Academy in West Point, where he meets a young Edgar Allan Poe, played by Harry Melling, who he thinks may have particular insight in this disturbing case. The film is based on a 2003 novel written by Louis Bayard, one that was likely opined because of the sudden wave of interest in murder mysteries due to the shock success of Knives Out back in 2019. Although this one feels more like it was written by Poe himself rather than the likes of, say, Agatha Christie, because this sucker is absolutely gloomy. And as the story progresses, it gets increasingly gruesome and bloody and grisly. One thing that you can't deny about this film is that from a technical standpoint, it is certainly competent at the bare minimum when it's not outright great. The cinematography is appropriately dark and matches the gothic and macabre tone of the film. The set design and costume work is impeccable, and it makes it easy for you to believe that you've been transported back to the 1830s. And the directing is certainly never boring or static. The director, Scott Cooper, at least knows how to frame a shot. And the acting's not too bad either. While nobody does excellent work here, and sometimes they do go a little bit too far with the overacting, they do at least manage to fill their roles appropriately and manage to keep you invested enough in what's going on, at least at first. With Harry Melling probably doing the best work in the film as Poe, who manages to strike a good balance between somebody who feels naive and out of his depth, but he also is interested in the macabre and death. Less than stellar, however, is the writing, particularly with the construction of its characters. Murder mysteries are reliant on an interesting cast of characters that line out both the suspects and the potential future victims, and this film just doesn't have it. None of the characters have any defining characteristics, and they're all pretty dull. Even the main character, Lander, doesn't even leave that much of an impression, despite the massive attempts to try to give him some depth. Really, the one character who actually feels like a person is, like I mentioned before, Poe, and not just because he's the only historical figure in the film. And then there's the film's third act, which gets overly ridiculous and over the top in some scenes, including a very out of place moment that involves a satanic sacrifice that just doesn't gel with the rest of the film at all. And when it's finally revealed what's been going on, it just doesn't feel right. It's not that the solution doesn't make sense, it's that it doesn't feel like it's come out of an Edgar Allan Poe story. It feels like it's wrought out of a melodramatic contemporary revenge story. It feels too clean, too tidy. It seems to want to bridge Poe's stories about the descent into madness and an Agatha Christie whodunit, and maybe a better film can pull it off, but this one doesn't. Not a total misfire, but definitely not a film that I'd want to see again anytime soon. The Pale Blue Eye gets a half-empty shot. Next up is the new Nicolas Cage Western film, and it's The Old Way. The movie tells the story of a former gunman, played by Nick Cage, who has long buried his past and has married the love of his life, and they have a daughter together. But when a man from Cage's past returns and kills his wife, he sets out on a quest of vengeance with his young daughter in tow. I didn't really know what to expect going into this film, but what perhaps most surprised me is that this is a very standard Western revenge plot. This film is actually so by the numbers that you could probably make a drinking game out of it. It contains pretty much every single overused line and scene that you could think of for this type of film. The ominous warning that the villains don't know who they're messing with, the warning to the hero about how vengeance is bad. Yeah, the first half was so standard that, aside from one scene where Nicolas Cage contemplates shooting his daughter, I was actually getting bored really quickly. The opening scene in particular is absolutely dismal, with a shootout that was so incomprehensible that I couldn't follow what was going on or why I should care. Oh, and they include a Wilhelm scream for no practical reason. So, I was about ready to dismiss this entire thing as just being total garbage, until we get about to the halfway point. For a few brief flickering moments, the movie suddenly came alive. The interactions between Cage and his daughter, played by Ryan Kiera Armstrong, actually started working. Now, their chemistry had been spotty before this point, namely because the film, for some reason, had been hinting that Cage despised his daughter and was actively treating her with contempt. But once we get to a mid-movie reveal that shows the connection that these two have, suddenly the movie gets more interesting. The conversations and back and forths that they have actually work, and even manage to produce a couple of surprisingly funny moments, like when the daughter tries her best to cry on the road so that she and her father can rob a man of his horse. There's also a wonderful scene where the two actually have a heart-to-heart by the campfire where they both lay out the darkness in their souls. But then, unfortunately, by the time the climax rolls around, the film reverts back to its standard Western cliches, and then the film completely lost me with an illogical and difficult-to-swallow plot twist that attempts to tie all the film's elements up to that point together, but it feels more like a fumble than a neat bow. Those expecting goofball Nicolas Cage will be disappointed, and unfortunately the film isn't good enough to deserve one of his good performances. Although, to his credit, he is good in here, and so is Armstrong as the little girl, as they both do their best to elevate lackluster material. I guess if you don't get your fill of the old school type westerns, you'll get it here, but even then it still doesn't do that part well. The shootouts aren't well shot, they're often difficult to follow, and have little to no sense of space, and the ones that you can follow just lack punch. The villains are boring, and yet for some reason we spend an inordinate amount of time with them. And the character motivations don't really feel consistent, particularly that of the young girl. The pieces for a good solid western are in here somewhere, but I think the script just needed more work, because as is, this feels like a first draft. The Old Way gets a half-empty shot. And now for the final film, we have Roald Dahl's Matilda the Musical. This one has been out for a while now, having been previously released in limited theaters before its Netflix release on Christmas Day. However, the film is returning to some theaters this weekend for a sing-along version, so if you missed the opportunity to see it in the theater, you have the ability to do so now. The film is an adaptation of the West End and Broadway musical, which was in and of itself an adaptation of the classic Roald Dahl novel, which tells the story of a young girl prodigy named Matilda, who must deal with both an abusive home life and an oppressive school led by an evil headmistress, Agatha Trunchbull, with her only place of solace being the books that she devours and her new loving teacher, Miss Honey. There's a reason that Dahl's story has survived for as long as it has and continues to grow in popularity, namely because the story's themes of child empowerment feel so universal regardless of time period. Probably what sticks out most about this story is that, as typical for a Roald Dahl story, there is wanton cruelty, but the cruelty in this one feels more personal, more down to earth when compared to his more whimsical cruelty in his other works, and that is represented in this film. I'm someone who's experienced pretty much every iteration of this story, the book, the 1996 film, and the stage musical. I say all this to say that while this is probably the weakest iteration of the story that I've seen to date, because of the inherent strength of the original work, this is still pretty good. Granted, at times the film does seem a bit like a Cliff Note version of the musical, often skimming past scenes that just go by too quickly, and not every casting decision works. Stephen Graham feels very out of place as Mr. Wormwood, with the meanness of the character feeling forced, and Emma Thompson, despite disappearing underneath all that makeup, isn't as threatening as Miss Trunchbull as I would have liked. However, the film does get a lot right, and I do mean a lot. As expected, the music is extraordinary, the sets, particularly at the school, look fantastic and are well utilized, like during the school song. And there were many roles that were well cast. Alicia Weir manages to hold her own as the lead character, and Lashana Lynch was perfectly cast as Miss Honey, evoking the kindness and warmth that we would expect from the character. And while the dancing and choreography is obviously more impressive when viewing it live, it's still lively, spirited, and exciting watching it here, particularly during the show-stopping number Revolting Children. And the film does take advantage of the film medium to tell the musical in a way that's not really possible live. Like during the climax, Matilda uses her telekinetic powers to build a giant chain monster, which was definitely a creative visual. Despite a few missteps here and there, the strength of the writing, the wonderful music, and the charming characters go a long way in making this an adaptation worth watching. Don't expect a musical masterpiece, but it is enjoyable. And if you're unable to experience the live show, this is a good version to check out. Matilda the Musical gets a full shot. Alright, the reviews for the week are done. Remember, as always, these are my personal opinions, and hopefully you were able to ascertain if any of these movies are ones that you would like to check out. And if you do decide to see any of these films that I reviewed, make sure to comment below what you thought of it to possibly have it featured in an upcoming episode. And now for a quick recap of what I thought of the films that I reviewed this week. A full shot for M3GAN, the surprisingly entertaining horror film that features a perfect combination of both chills and laughs, and is self-aware without coming across as campy. The film is currently in wide release. A half full shot for A Man Called Otto, a film that's got a lot of laughs and nice interactions between the characters, but can't quite juggle its tone as good as the original film. It's currently in limited release and is scheduled to go into wide release on January 13th. A half-empty shot for The Pale Blue Eye, a dark gothic murder mystery that ends up being too melodramatic to feel like a proper representation of Edgar Allan Poe's works. The film is currently available for streaming on Netflix. A half-empty shot for The Old Way, a run-of-the-mill western that had promise when it explored the father-daughter dynamic, but completely fell apart elsewhere. The film is set for a limited theatrical run this week before heading to VOD January 13th. And finally, a full shot for Roald Dahl's Matilda the Musical, a mostly charming and very lively adaptation of the classic story. The film is currently available on Netflix, with a sing-along version being released in limited theaters this week. So the one that I really liked the best this week is actually the one that I thought that I was going to dislike the most, and that's M3GAN. And if you're into these kind of films, I think you're really going to enjoy it. And remember, if you want to see any of my early thoughts of any film that I watch, or to read more of my reviews, make sure to check out my Letterboxd account. The link is in the description below. That's it for now. Next time, you're invited to a huge party at LeBron James's mansion in the remake of the 1990 comedy House Party. And Gerard Butler and Mike Colter work to save hostages after a terrible crash in plane. And make sure that you're subscribed so that you don't miss any upcoming episodes. Have a good day, and I'll see you next weekend.